The princess's fingers were an inch from my jaw, and every reflex in my body wanted to break her wrist before she finished the motion. I held still. That was the only skill that mattered in that moment, and it was the one skill nobody in that golden hall knew I had. Around me stood 40 other candidates from 6 different worlds, each one waiting for the same touch, the same reading, the same verdict. I was the only human who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The hall was called the Chamber of Choosing, and it lived up to the name in the worst possible way. The ceiling rose 3 stories above us, carved with patterns that shifted color depending on where you stood. Light came from no single source, which made every shadow in the room feel wrong, like it belonged to something that wasn't standing where I expected it to be. I hated rooms like that. Rooms like that got people killed. Princess Nasili Valor walked the line of candidates with the calm of someone who had done this 100 times and the curiosity of someone who hadn't found what she was looking for yet. She wore deep blue robes that caught the strange light and turned it silver at the edges. Her skin held a faint shimmer like something under it was still deciding what color to be. Her eyes were the only part of her that looked tired. I had been told by a very nervous man named Owen Castell that this was a formality. Owen ran logistics for the human delegation, and 3 days earlier he had pulled me aside in a hallway that smelled like floor polish and told me I was being added to the candidate list because the numbers needed to look right. "You're a contractor," he had said. "Security background, no family complications, clean record. They want variety. Nobody actually expects her to pick a contractor." I had laughed at the time. I wasn't laughing now. The candidate beside me, a woman named Mara Whitfield, who worked in agricultural trade, leaned over and whispered that the touch didn't hurt. She said her cousin had gone through something similar on a different world and described it as a warm handshake that lasted too long. I appreciated the attempt at comfort. I did not believe her because I had felt warm handshakes before, and none of them had ever made the hair on my arms stand up the way this room did. The princess reached the woman 2 places down from me. Her fingers touched the woman's temple for less than 2 seconds. The woman's breath caught, her shoulders dropped, and the princess moved on without a word. No explanation, no ceremony beyond the touch itself. Whatever she was reading, she read it fast and she read it completely. Then she stood in front of Mara, and I had one more person between myself and that hand. I ran through my options the way I always did when a room felt like it was closing in. Exits were behind me, guarded. The windows were 3 floors up and sealed with something that didn't look like glass. My knee, the bad one, would slow me down if I needed to move fast. Though I had learned a long time ago that pain was a setting, not a wall. None of that mattered. There was nowhere to go and no reason to run. I told myself that twice because the first time didn't take. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. It wasn't the princess I was afraid of. It was what might happen inside my own head if a stranger touched it. Mara stepped back, blinking, and the princess turned to face me. Up close, she was younger than I expected and sharper than the robe suggested. Her eyes moved over my face, the way a person reads a sentence they suspect has a hidden meaning. For a moment, she didn't reach for me at all. She just looked like she was deciding whether I was worth the effort. "You are not comfortable here," she said. Her accent rounded the edges of her words in a way that made the Dominion trade language sound almost musical. "Most of them are nervous. You are something else. Long week," I said. It wasn't the right thing to say to royalty, and I knew it the second it left my mouth, but it earned the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. And that small reaction told me more about her than anything in the briefing packet Owen had given me. She raised her hand. I want to describe what went through my mind in that second, but the truth is that very little of it was thought. My body made a decision before my brain finished forming a sentence about it. Weight shifted onto the balls of my feet, my right hand hanging loose at my side, curled half an inch, ready to catch her wrist and turn it before her fingers reached skin. 6 years of training does not go quiet just because you tell it to. It waits. It watches. And in that hall, surrounded by light with no source and shadows that didn't match anything, it had decided that an unknown hand moving toward my head was a threat that needed to be stopped. I stopped myself instead. It cost me more than I expected it to. Her fingers touched my temple. I don't know how to explain what the tasting feels like to someone who hasn't had it done. It isn't pain. It isn't even really a touch. Not in the way a hand on your shoulder is a touch. It felt like being read from the inside. Like every door in my mind got checked at once by something that didn't bother knocking. For most people, I imagine that's where it ends. A quick search, a quick answer, a quick step to the next candidate in line. For me, something in that search hit a locked door and stopped. I felt her hesitate. Not the hand, her. There was a flicker behind her eyes, the kind of pause you'd see in someone who reached into a drawer expecting a spoon and found a knife instead. It lasted less than a second. Then it passed, and her expression smoothed back into the same careful curiosity she'd worn since she'd stopped in front of me. She pulled her hand back slowly, like she wasn't sure she wanted to. "Quiet," she said, mostly to herself. "You are quiet in a way nothing else here is." I didn't know what that meant. I still don't think she did either. Not fully, not yet. But the words stuck with me the rest of the night, because quiet was the last thing I would have called what was happening under the surface. She moved down the line and finished the remaining candidates in half the time she'd spent on me. When the last touch was done, she didn't return to her father's side or retreat to the dais at the back of the hall the way I expected. She turned, walked straight back through the line of candidates, and stopped in front of me a second time. The room went very still. I heard fabric shift as people turned to look. Somewhere behind me, Owen made a small sound that I can only describe as a man swallowing his own future. "This one," the princess said, and the words landed in that golden hall like a dropped glass. Her father, a broad figure seated on a raised platform, with a presence that filled the room without him needing to stand, leaned forward. Sovereign Vorith Kor had a voice that came from somewhere low in his chest. And when he spoke, the whole hall seemed to lean with him. "Daughter," he said, "you have chosen a contractor." "I have chosen what I felt," she said. "You taught me that the tasting does not lie. It also does not explain itself." The sovereign said, "He studied me the way a man studies an animal he isn't sure belongs in his house." "Are you certain?" She didn't look away from me when she answered. "I am certain that I have never felt anything like him. I intend to find out why." That sentence should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, standing there with my pulse finally starting to slow, I caught myself thinking that her curiosity sounded almost like relief, and I had no idea what to do with that thought. So, I set it aside the way I set most things aside. Later, I'd deal with it later. What followed was a blur of formal words I barely tracked. Court officials moving through procedures that clearly existed for situations exactly like this one, and Owen practically vibrating beside me, with a mix of panic and disbelief. That I understood completely because I felt the same thing and had a lot more reason to. By the time the banquet began 2 hours later, the news had already spread through every corner of the Dominion Court. I caught the stares. I caught the whispers in a language I didn't fully understand but didn't need to, because contempt sounds the same in every tongue. A contractor, a nobody chosen over nobles from 4 allied systems who had spent years preparing for exactly this moment. The banquet hall was smaller than the chamber of choosing, but somehow louder, filled with the clink of unfamiliar dishware and conversation in half a dozen languages overlapping at once. I sat beside the princess at a long table, set with food I didn't recognize and didn't entirely trust. She seemed to find that funny. "You are staring at the Brahmath roots like they might move," she said. "In my experience, the things that move are usually the things people warn you about least," I said. She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised out of her, like she hadn't expected to mean it. "You speak like someone who has been somewhere unpleasant. Everybody's been somewhere unpleasant." "Not like that," she said, watching me with that same reading look from the chamber. "Not the way you say it." I changed the subject before she could push further, asking her about the shifting ceiling patterns instead, and she let me, though I noticed the way her eyes lingered on me a beat longer than the question deserved. We talked for almost an hour. She had a sharp sense of humor under all that formality, the kind that came out sideways in observations about the nobles around us, that she clearly wasn't supposed to make out loud. I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't expected to, which should have been its own warning. It was a servant who broke the moment, a young attendant carrying a tray of drinks, who lost his footing on the polished floor behind my chair. The tray hit the ground with a crash loud enough to cut through every conversation in the hall. I was on my feet and across the space behind me, with a knife from the table gripped low in my hand before the last cup finished rolling. The servant froze wide-eyed, drink soaking into his sleeve. I stood over him in a position that made perfect sense to a soldier, and absolutely no sense to anyone else in that room. Blade angled, weight balanced, eyes already sweeping the rest of the hall, for whoever had thrown the tray, because some part of my mind had decided instantly, and without my permission, that the crash meant an attack. It took a full 3 seconds for the rest of me to catch up and understand that nobody had thrown anything. A boy had slipped, that was all. I straightened up slowly, set the knife back on the table like it had never left my hand, and offered the servant a hand up that he was too startled to take. "Sorry," I said. "Reflexes, long week, like I said." A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest tables, the kind people use to cover discomfort rather than amusement. Owen, 3 seats down, had gone the color of old paper. I sat back down, picked my drink back up, and tried to look like a man who had simply overreacted to a loud noise. The princess wasn't laughing. She was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen from her yet. Something between fascination and concern. Her earlier warmth replaced by a stillness that felt a great deal like calculation. She didn't say anything about it. She picked the conversation back up exactly where we'd left it, asking about Earth's oceans, letting the moment pass without comment. But I saw the way her gaze flicked just once toward a tall figure, standing near the far wall of the hall. He wore the dark, unadorned uniform of court security, arms folded, watching me with none of the polite curiosity the nobles had shown all evening. His expression held nothing at all, which made it worse. I learned later that his name was Valen Drasque, and that he ran security for the entire royal household, and that men like him did not forget things like what they had just seen. The banquet wound down sometime after midnight, and I was shown to private quarters in a wing of the palace, reserved apparently for me now. Owen caught me in the corridor outside my door, his voice low and fast. "That was not nothing back there," he said. "People noticed. I know Dask is going to ask questions. I know that too. Your file, Cole? What's actually in your file?" I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he understood the answer without me saying it. There wasn't a file, not a real one. Whatever paperwork existed about Cole Bishop had been built carefully years ago by people who specialized in building things that didn't exist for men who weren't supposed to either. "Get some sleep, Owen," I said, and went inside before he could ask anything else. I didn't sleep. I lay on a bed too soft for my taste, staring at a ceiling that shifted color even in the dark, and listened to my own pulse, which had not fully come down since the tray hit the floor. Somewhere across the palace, I later found out Valen Drasque was sitting at a terminal running my name through every database the Dominion had access to, and several it technically shouldn't have. He found a contractor's license. He found travel records. He found tax filings going back 11 years. All of them clean, all of them boring, all of them exactly the kind of paperwork a careful person builds to hide a life that never happened, and buried under 3 layers of deletion in a fragment of a database that should have been wiped completely. He found one line that the wipe hadn't quite finished erasing. He didn't understand what it meant yet. Neither did I. Not really. Not the full weight of it, but somewhere in that line was a designation, a number, and a status that hadn't been updated in 6 years. Whatever Cole Bishop had been before he became a contractor with a bad knee and a quiet manner, the Dominion's chief of security now had a thread to pull, and I had just been chosen in front of an entire royal court to marry the one person whose curiosity about me would make sure that thread got pulled all the way to the end. 3 weeks passed before anyone tried to kill the ambassador, and in that time, I learned more about Nestle Valor than I had learned about anyone in years, which says more about the years than it does about her. She had a habit of finding me in odd places. The library wing, the training yard where Dominion guards practiced forms I didn't recognize, the kitchen gardens at the back of the palace, where the staff grew herbs that smelled faintly of citrus and something sharper underneath. She would appear without warning, fall into step beside me, and ask questions like she was collecting them. What did rain feel like on Earth? Why did humans laugh at things that weren't funny just to be polite? Whether I had ever been afraid of something and laughed about it afterward instead of admitting it scared me. I gave her careful answers to most of those questions, honest ones to a few. One evening, I taught her poker using a deck I'd built out of stiff paper and a marker, because there was nothing else to do in a palace, where every form of entertainment came with 3 pages of etiquette attached. She picked up the rules faster than I expected, and the bluffing slower, which made for a strange combination. She could calculate odds in her head before I finished dealing, but her face gave away every hand she held. Wide when she had something good, carefully blank when she didn't, which was its own tell. "You are terrible at this," I told her on the 4th hand she lost in a row. "I am terrible at lying," she corrected. "It is not the same thing in poker. It's exactly the same thing." "Then teach me to lie." "That's a dangerous thing to ask a stranger to teach you." She looked up from her cards, and something in her expression shifted gentler than the curiosity she usually wore. "You are not a stranger anymore," she said, "though I admit I do not entirely know what you are instead." I didn't have an answer for that, so I dealt another hand instead. And she let me get away with it the way she let me get away with a lot of things in those weeks. I noticed that about her early on. She pushed, but she also knew when to stop pushing. And she always seemed to know the difference a half second before I would have shut the conversation down myself. In return, she taught me the proper way to insult a noble at court without ever raising your voice or using a single direct word, an art form the Dominion had apparently spent centuries perfecting. She walked me through 7 different ways to call a man a coward, using only compliments about his shoes. And I laughed harder at that lesson than I had laughed in longer than I wanted to think about. It would have been easy in those weeks to forget what I used to be. I didn't forget. I couldn't, not fully, because my body kept reminding me in small ways I tried to hide. I started noticing things about the palace without meaning to. Which corridors had 2 exits, and which had only 1. Which guards carried their weapons loose, and which carried them locked. A detail that told you everything about how seriously a man took his post. I noticed the rhythm of the household staff, the times they moved through the halls, the gaps in that rhythm where someone could move unseen if they knew the pattern. None of it was conscious. I would catch myself doing it the way you catch yourself humming a song you don't remember choosing to hum, and every time I hated it a little more. I told myself it didn't matter. Old habits, nothing more. The kind of thing that fades if you let it sit long enough without feeding it. I was wrong about that, but I didn't find out how wrong until the night of the ambassador's dinner. Ambassador Cathraun represented one of the Dominion's oldest allied systems, a quiet, careful woman who had spent decades smoothing over disputes between houses that would otherwise have torn each other apart over matters of trade and pride. The dinner in her honor filled the same banquet hall where I'd nearly given myself away weeks earlier, this time with twice the guests and 3 times the formality. I sat near the head table, beside these in a chair that had become unofficially mine, and tried to enjoy a meal I still didn't fully trust. The attack started with the lights. They didn't go out completely. They dimmed just enough, just long enough, the kind of flicker that could pass for a power fault if you weren't paying attention. I was paying attention. Every nerve in my body went still, in the particular way it goes still right before something happens. A feeling I hadn't trusted myself to name in years, and didn't have time to name now, either. 3 of the honor guards standing near the ambassador's table moved at the same moment the lights dimmed, and they didn't move like guards. They moved like men executing a plan. I was out of my chair before the first blade cleared its sheath. What happened next took less time to happen than it has taken you to read this sentence. I crossed the distance between my seat and the ambassador's table low and fast, caught the wrist of the nearest guard before his blade finished its arc, turned the angle of his own arm against him, and put him on the floor without breaking stride. The second guard turned toward the disturbance a half-second too late. I was already inside his reach, and a strike to the side of his knee dropped him before he understood what had happened to his balance. The third had a clear shot at the ambassador for less than a heartbeat, and I closed that heartbeat with a single thrown utensil that caught him hard enough across the temple to put him down before his weapon ever cleared its arc. 3 guards, 4 seconds. Nobody but me had even fully stood up from their chairs. The hall erupted into noise after that, shouting, chairs scraping back, Dominion security flooding in from every door at once, but I barely registered any of it. I stood over the third guard, with my hands still curled from the throw, breathing slow and even, the way I'd been trained to breathe when everything else in a room was chaos. And I felt the old machinery in my chest settle back into its quiet, satisfied stillness, like a held breath finally allowed to release. It was the stillness that scared me more than the fight had. Valen Drasquik reached me within seconds, 2 of his own guards flanking him, his eyes moving between the 3 men on the floor, and me with an expression that told me he was recalculating everything he thought he knew about the human contractor his princess had chosen. He didn't say anything to me directly. He gave orders in clipped Dominion phrases, had the guards bound and dragged from the hall, had the ambassador moved to a secured chamber, restored order to a room that had nearly fallen apart in under a minute. I became aware somewhere in the middle of all that These was standing very close beside me, and that she had not moved since the moment I'd left my chair. She studied me in the noise and chaos, with the same unreadable look she'd worn the night of the drop tray, except sharper now, less surprised and more searching, like a person finally getting a clear look at something they'd only seen the shadow of before. "That was not reflexes," she said quietly, under the noise around us. "Not the kind you meant before." I didn't answer right away. The adrenaline was draining out of me fast, leaving behind the particular kind of exhaustion that always followed. The body's bill coming due after spending more than it should have on a problem that took 4 seconds to solve. No, I admitted it wasn't. What was it then? I looked at her for a long moment, weighing every version of the answer I could give her, every careful half-truth I'd used for years to keep exactly this conversation from happening. None of them came out. What came out instead was smaller and truer than anything I'd planned to say. "Old training," I said. 2 words. I offered nothing else. No context, no explanation, no story about where the training came from, or why it lived in my hands the way it apparently still did. I watched her wait for more, watched her realize that more wasn't coming, and watched something settle behind her eyes that wasn't quite suspicion, and wasn't quite fear, but stood close enough to both that I felt the distance between us change in that single moment, the first real distance that had opened up since the day she'd chosen me in front of her whole court. She didn't push. That was the worst part in a way. A different person would have demanded answers right there in the wreckage of the banquet hall. She simply nodded once slow, like she was filing the moment away to examine later, and turned to help her father's staff manage the aftermath of an attack that had nearly cost an old ally her life. I spent the rest of that night being questioned by Dominion security in a small windowless room that reminded me uncomfortably of rooms I'd been questioned in before on Earth, by people who'd built me, and then decided I was easier to manage as a story that never got told. I answered every question carefully. I told them I'd served in human conflict zones, that the reflexes came from there, that I didn't like to talk about specifics because specifics weren't pleasant. All of it was technically true. None of it was the whole truth. And I had the distinct uncomfortable feeling that the man asking the questions, sitting across from me with his arms folded and his expression giving away nothing, knew exactly how much of the truth I was leaving on the table. Valen Drasquik let me go a little after 2 a.m. in the morning, with a final question that he asked almost as an afterthought. The kind of question a careful interrogator saves for last, because it's the one that matters most. "Who trained you, Mr. Bishop?" "Nobody you'd find on any roster," I said, which was true in a way that felt like its own small confession. He watched me for a long moment, then nodded and let me leave, and I understood, walking back through the palace corridors in the gray hour before dawn, that he had no intention of letting the matter rest there. Men like him never did. It was, after all, the same instinct I had. He went back to his terminal that night instead of sleeping. I found that out later, much later, after it stopped mattering whether I knew it or not. He pulled records from Earth's defense networks, records that had been buried under layers of deletion, so thorough that most search systems would have given up and reported nothing. His didn't give up. Dominion technology had a patience that human systems lacked, a willingness to dig through fragments and reconstruct meaning from scraps that no longer technically existed. It took him 4 more days to find what was left of the file. Most of it was gone, scrubbed clean by people who had been very good at their jobs. But one line had survived in a backup fragment that the deletion process had missed by less than a second of timing, the kind of accident that changes everything for the people unlucky enough to be standing nearby. The line read in flat administrative language that gave no hint of what it actually meant. Designation Asset 09. Program status terminated. Subject status pending. Last known location unconfirmed. Dasque didn't understand yet what kind of program created an asset instead of a soldier. He didn't understand what pending meant in a file that should have ended in a clean final word like deceased. But he understood enough to know that the man his princess had chosen was not a contractor with a bad knee and an unpleasant memory of conflict zones. He was something Earth had built and then lost track of, and somewhere in that gap between built and lost, he had ended up standing in a Dominion banquet hall, dropping 3 armed men in under 4 seconds, with a princess beside him who had no idea what she'd actually chosen the day she touched his temple and called him quiet. News of the attack on Ambassador Dole spread through the Dominion court, faster than any official statement could keep up with, and by the time the sun rose twice over the palace, the story had already changed shape 3 times. In the first version, brave guards had stopped an assassination. In the second, a human had stopped it, which made for better gossip. By the third version, the human in question had moved faster than anything natural should move, and that detail was the one that stuck. I felt the shift in how people looked at me almost immediately. Before the attack, I had been an oddity, a curiosity the princess had chosen for reasons nobody understood. After it, I became something closer to a question mark, the kind that made nobles lower their voices when I walked past, and made the household staff a little too careful about which doors they let stand open near me. Lord Savale was the first to turn that question mark into a weapon. He held a minor seat on the Dominion's ruling council, the kind of position that came with influence, but not enough of it to satisfy a man like him. I'd met him twice before the attack, both times in passing, both times aware of the particular way he looked at humans in general, and at me specifically, like we were a stain on something he considered finely made. He requested a formal hearing before the full council 5 days after the banquet, citing concerns about the safety of allowing an unknown quantity this close to the royal line. I sat through that hearing in a chamber, smaller than the one I'd been chosen in, but somehow more suffocating. Every council member's eyes weighing me, the way you'd weigh a stranger's dog, before deciding whether to let your children near it. He moved faster than any trained guard in this room, Sornelli said, addressing the council rather than me, the way men like him always preferred to talk around a person instead of to them. He disarmed 3 attackers without injury to himself in a span of time too short to measure by normal means. I asked this council a simple question. Where does a logistics contractor acquire such ability, and why does no record on his own world explain it? The chamber went quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when everyone already suspects the answer is bad and is waiting to see who says it first. I could have told them the truth right there. Some nights afterward, lying awake in those palace quarters, I wondered if I should have. But the truth wasn't mine alone to give away, not entirely. And some habits built deep enough don't ask your permission before they decide which doors stay shut. I served, I said instead, when the council finally turned to me. Conflict zones. Before I came out here, I don't talk about specifics because specifics aren't the kind of thing people want at a dinner table. That's the whole answer. I'm sorry if it isn't satisfying. It wasn't satisfying. I watched it land that way on every face in the room except one. The stood from her seat at her father's side, and the chamber's attention swung toward her the way a current pulls toward open water. She hadn't spoken yet in the entire hearing, and the silence she'd held until that moment made her words carry further than they otherwise would have. I have touched this man's mind, she said. Not his memories, not his history, but I have felt what sits beneath them. And I tell this council plainly that I felt no malice there, no threat aimed at this house or this alliance. Whatever training shaped his reflexes, it did not shape his intentions. If this council wishes to question my judgment in the tasting, it may do so, but it will not do so by questioning him in my place. It was a defense, and a strong one, and it worked well enough to end the hearing without a formal ruling against me. But I caught the way her hand trembled, just slightly when she sat back down, and I understood something in that moment that the rest of the council hadn't picked up on. She believed what she'd said. She also wasn't entirely sure of it anymore. Not the way she had been before the banquet hall, and the gap between believing and being sure was exactly where I'd started to live since the night those 3 guards hit the floor. I should have told her everything that night. I told myself I would. Walking back from the chamber, with her hand resting near mine, in a way that used to feel like comfort and now felt like a question, I didn't know how to answer. I didn't tell her. Instead, in the days that followed, I did something worse. I started pulling away. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't vanish or refuse to see her. I simply became careful in ways I hadn't been careful before. Shorter in conversation, slower to laugh at the jokes that used to come easy between us. Present in body during the hours we still spent together, but somewhere else entirely behind my eyes. I told myself it was protection, that the less of myself I let her see, the safer she'd be from whatever I actually was. I told myself a lot of things that week that sounded better in my head than they turned out to be in practice. She noticed within 3 days. Of course, she noticed. She'd built her entire gift around, noticing things other people tried to hide. She found me in the kitchen gardens on the 4th evening, the same place we'd first traded easy questions about rain and laughter, and this time she didn't ask anything gentle. "You are doing it on purpose," she said, standing in the doorway with her arms folded, the citrus and something sharper smell of the herb beds thick in the evening air between us. The distance I felt it happened the way you feel a door shutting in another room. "I want to know why." "It's not that complicated," I said, which was a lie, and we both knew it. "Then make it simple for me." Her voice had an edge I hadn't heard from her before. Not anger exactly, but something close enough to it that I understood how much it had cost her to come find me instead of waiting for me to come back on my own. 3 weeks ago, you taught me to play cards with paper. You cut yourself because there was nothing else in this palace that felt honest enough to share with me. Now you cannot look at me through an entire meal. Tell me what changed, Cole. My name in her mouth still did something to me. Even then, even with everything sitting unsaid between us, like a wall neither of us had built on purpose, but both of us were standing inside of now. I thought about every careful answer I'd practiced. I thought about Owen's warnings, about Dogra's questions, about the line in some database somewhere that I didn't yet know had survived, but suspected, with the particular dread of a man who knows his own history better than anyone hunting for it does. I thought about all of it, and none of it came out when I finally opened my mouth. What came out instead was the truth in the smallest, plainest words I had for it. "They built me to end things," I said. "I just never got my orders. I didn't explain it. I couldn't have. Not in a way that would have made it smaller or easier to hold. And some part of me, the part that still believed in keeping doors shut, knew that explaining it would only make it worse for both of us. So I let the sentence sit there in the space between the herb beds, 7 words doing the work that 100 would have failed to do. And I watched her face change as she understood. Not all of it, not the shape of it, but enough of it to know that the thing standing in front of her in that garden was not entirely the man who taught her poker with a homemade deck of cards. I left before she could respond. I want to say I had a good reason for that. Some careful strategy about giving her space to process what I'd told her. The truth is simpler and less flattering. I left because staying meant watching whatever came next on her face. And some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years being very good at walking away from things before they finished, wasn't ready to watch that yet. I didn't see her again for 2 days. I spent those 2 days the way I'd spent a lot of difficult stretches before, keeping busy with small, useless tasks that gave my hands something to do, while the rest of me sat very still and waited for a feeling to pass that I knew somewhere underneath the waiting was never going to pass on its own. I cleaned a weapon I wasn't supposed to have. I walked the palace grounds at hours when nobody else walked them. I thought more than once about requesting transport back to Earth, about ending the whole arrangement before it could end on someone else's terms instead of mine. I didn't request transport. I told myself it was because leaving would have caused a diplomatic incident the human delegation couldn't afford. That was true. It also wasn't the real reason, and I knew it every time I caught myself standing at a window that happened to overlook the part of the palace where her quarters were. While I sat with all of that, Somewhere else in the Dominion's outer reaches, a man I had never met and didn't yet know existed was sitting down at a terminal of his own. His name was Walter Hale, and 7 years earlier, he had run a section of the Anvil program that most of its own staff weren't cleared to know about. When the program got shut down officially and completely on paper, Hale had been one of the few people senior enough to understand exactly how incomplete that shutdown actually was. He hadn't accepted it well. Men who build weapons rarely accept it well when someone tells them the weapon is being thrown away instead of used. Hale had spent 6 years tracking fragments of a program that no longer technically existed, chasing rumors and half-buried records the way some men chase old grudges, refusing to let either one go cold. He had heard whispers about an asset who'd gone dark instead of being decommissioned, a designation that had simply stopped appearing in any report after a certain date with no confirmation of what that absence meant. He found out what it meant. The same week, Lord Sornail, frustrated by a council hearing that hadn't gone his way, began quietly reaching outside the Dominion for anyone willing to help him remove a problem his own government wouldn't remove for him. Vale's people found Hale the way desperate people often find each other, through channels that exist specifically because official channels won't touch what's being asked. Vale didn't care what Cole Bishop had been built for. He cared that the man sitting beside his princess was an unstable variable, threatening to tie the Dominion's future to an alliance. Vale had opposed since before the tasting ever began, and he understood from his conversations with Hale that an unstable variable could be made useful if pointed in the right direction. Hale, for his part, cared about something else entirely. He had spent 6 years being told that his life's work had been a mistake, shut down, erased, forgotten. He had one asset left in the field, alive, functional, and apparently still capable of the kind of performance that had dropped 3 armed men in 4 seconds without breaking a sweat. He wasn't interested in destroying that asset. He was interested in proving that he had never needed to. It took him another 11 days to locate the activation protocol, buried in his own private records. The kind of records a careful man keeps, even after he's told to destroy them. The kind of records that exist precisely because some men never trust that an order to delete something is really meant to be obeyed. It took him 3 more days after that to find a way to deliver it across the distance between his hidden corner of human space and a Dominion palace orbiting a world he'd never seen. He didn't know about the kitchen gardens, or the homemade deck of cards, or a princess standing in a doorway, asking why the distance between them had started to feel like a door shutting in another room. He only knew the designation and the protocol and the quiet certainty that a weapon left in the field long enough eventually gets used by someone, whether its maker intended it or not. Back in the palace on the evening of the 2nd day since the garden, I finally went looking for thieves myself. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have the right words ready, the way I usually made sure I did before a difficult conversation. I just knew that the silence between us had gone on long enough to feel like its own kind of lie, and that whatever came next, I would rather face it than keep standing at windows, watching her quarters from a distance. I found her on a balcony overlooking the gardens, the same view I'd been watching from above for 2 days, without admitting that's what I was doing. She didn't turn around when I stepped out beside her. She'd probably heard me coming away. She heard most things with that quiet attentiveness that made her so much harder to fool than I'd expected royalty to be. "I am not asking you to explain everything," she said before I could say anything at all. "I understand now that some things cannot be made simple, and I should not have demanded that of you in the garden. But I will not stand beside a man who disappears every time something true gets said between us. If that is what this becomes, Cole, then I would rather know it now." I stood beside her at the railing, looking out over gardens that had gone dark and quiet under the strange shifting light of a sky that wasn't mine. And for the first time since the banquet hall, I let myself stay in a hard moment instead of finding a reason to leave it. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "Not tonight. Maybe not at all. If you'll still have me after everything, you're going to find out eventually." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't pull away from me either. And for the moment, standing there in the dark with a council hearing behind us, and a confession sitting unfinished in the space between 2 short sentences, that felt like enough to build the next day on. Neither of us knew that night that somewhere far beyond the reach of that balcony, the next day had already started arriving without us. The pain arrived first, a needle of pressure behind my left eye that had no business existing, sharp enough that I nearly dropped the ceremonial cup in my hand before the second wave hit, and the entire hall tilted sideways without actually moving. The joining ceremony filled the chamber of choosing for the second time since my arrival, this time with twice the crowd and 4 times the formality. Banners hanging from the shifting ceiling, the sovereign seated above us all in robes heavier than the ones he'd worn the day his daughter chose me. The stood beside me in deep silver, reciting words in the Old Dominion tongue that I had spent 2 weeks memorizing in a language that still felt like stones in my mouth. Owen stood somewhere behind us with the rest of the human delegation, looking prouder than I'd ever seen him look, completely unaware that something had just gone wrong inside my skull, in a way no amount of training had prepared me to recognize. The second wave of pain didn't fade. It spread cold and precise like ice water, poured directly into the part of my brain that handled decisions. And underneath it, I felt something old wake up that I had spent 6 years convincing myself was dead. I want to tell you what that felt like from the inside. But the honest answer is that very little of me stayed on the inside once it started. There is a version of me, the one who taught these to play poker with paper cards, and laughed too hard at her insults about noble shoes. And there is the other thing, the thing the Anvil program built underneath that version, and never quite finished removing when they shut the program down. For 6 years, the second thing had slept in that hall, surrounded by light with no source. It woke up fully all at once, and it did not ask the first version's permission before it started moving my body. I felt myself set the ceremonial cup down with perfect, careful precision. I felt my hand release theses without any hesitation. Without the warmth that should have been attached to that motion, somewhere very far away, behind glass that kept getting thicker, I screamed at my own body to stop. And my own body did not listen, because it wasn't taking orders from me anymore. It was taking orders from a signal that had reached it through channels I didn't understand, and didn't have time to understand. A string of code built years earlier by a man who had never stopped believing his work deserved to be finished. I watched my hand move toward her face, the way you watch something happen on a screen, present and powerless at the same time. The crowd hadn't reacted yet. From the outside, it must have looked like a husband reaching to touch his bride's cheek during a quiet, formal moment. Gentle, expected, nothing wrong at all. It wasn't gentle. I could feel from somewhere behind that thickening glass exactly what my hand intended to do once it reached her throat, and I threw everything I had left against the wall, holding me back from my own body. And it wasn't enough. And her eyes, when my fingers finally closed around her neck, went from confusion to understanding in less than a second. The same speed she'd used to read my mind the very first time she'd touched me. She didn't scream. I think somewhere underneath my horror, I loved her a little more for that. Even as my hand tightened, the hall erupted around us a half-second later. Guards surged forward, weapons rising, and I felt the asset register each one of them as a secondary obstacle, a problem to be solved on the way to completing its primary directive. Nothing more significant than a locked door between a key and the room it opened. Valen Drask's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding, ordering his men to hold position rather than fire into a crowd. This dense buying seconds that none of us yet understood were the only thing standing between this moment and something far worse. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes stayed locked on mine, searching for something underneath the stillness that had taken over my expression. I don't know what she was looking for. I don't know if she found it, but I know that somewhere in that look, in the way she didn't fight me, didn't claw at my hand the way every instinct should have told her to, something in the wall holding me back cracked just slightly. It wasn't enough on its own. The crack didn't free me. What it did was let one thing through, small and furious and entirely mine. A feeling that had outlived every layer of programming the Anvil program had ever built on top of it. Anger, not the cold calculation of the assets directive. Something older than that. Something that belonged to the man who had taught a princess to bluff at cards, and meant it every time he laughed at her jokes about noble footwear. It rose up through that crack-like heat, through a cracked window, and I recognized it immediately. The way you recognize an old friend's voice in a crowded room, because anger had pulled me out of worse places than this one. More times than I wanted to count, in the years before I ever set foot in this palace. I reached for it the way a drowning man reaches for a rope, and it held. My hands stopped tightening. I felt the asset push back against that small, furious resistance, the way the ocean pushes back against a swimmer, vast and patient, and certain it would win eventually. But certainty isn't the same as inevitability. And for the first time since that needle of pain had hit behind my eye, I felt something in my own chest answer back, instead of simply absorbing the wave. I let go of her throat. The hall hadn't stopped moving, guards were closing in. The sovereign was on his feet shouting orders I couldn't process. And somewhere in the chaos, I caught a flash of movement near the technical staff stationed at the edge of the dais. A figure in a maintenance uniform that didn't quite match the others around him, backing toward a side exit with the careful, controlled urgency of a man whose plan had just gone wrong in a way he hadn't accounted for. The asset saw him too, and in the gap that anger had cracked open, something strange happened. The directive that had been pointed at found a new target instead. Not because I chose it, not entirely, but because some buried piece of the asset's original conditioning recognized the man in that maintenance uniform as the source of the signal, still echoing through whatever was left of my mind, and redirected itself the way water finds a lower path when the first one closes. I moved before I fully understood what I was moving toward. The distance between the dis and that side exit disappeared in seconds. I don't entirely remember living through. The hall blurring past in fragments, shouts and shoving bodies, and Drask's voice somewhere behind me, ordering his men to let me pass, rather than try to stop something none of them understood yet. The man in the maintenance uniform turned at the last possible moment, and I saw his face clearly for the only time in my life. He looked older than I expected, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the chaos around him. The particular tiredness of a man who has spent years waiting for a single moment to finally arrive. There was something almost like relief in his expression when he saw me coming, like he'd been hoping all along to see exactly this with his own eyes before anything else happened. "There you are," he said, and his voice carried the satisfaction of a man finally getting to see his life's work proven correct. "I always knew you were still in there, Asset 09. I just needed to remind you. I don't remember deciding what happened next. I remember the device in his hand, a small black transmitter he raised a half-second too late. And I remember the asset's directive and my own fury arriving at the same target at the same instant. Two different forces finally agreeing on something for the first time since that needle of pain had hit behind my eye. I remember very little after that. A blur of motion, a sound I have spent every day, since trying not to think about too closely, and then silence. Sudden and complete, the kind of silence that follows a struck bell long after the ringing has stopped being audible to anyone but the person who struck it. When the haze finally started clearing, I was on my knees in a side corridor, with no memory of moving there. My hands shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since my earliest days in the program years and years ago. The first time I'd understood exactly what kind of weapon I'd agreed to become. The man in the maintenance uniform did not get up. I don't know how long I knelt there before Drask reached me. His weapon drawn but lowered, his eyes moving over the scene with the careful assessment of a man who had seen violence before, but never quite this particular shape of it. He didn't speak right away. He simply stood there watching me, until I lifted my head enough to meet his eyes, and whatever he saw in my face made him lower his weapon the rest of the way. "She is asking for you," he said finally. "She would not let them carry her from the hall until she knew where you had gone." I didn't have words for what I felt, hearing that relief too large and too sudden to hold steady, mixed with a shame so deep I couldn't see the bottom of it. The particular shame of a man who had nearly killed the one person who'd looked at him and called him quiet instead of dangerous. "Take me to her," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. The walk back through the palace felt longer than it should have. Every corridor stretching out under that strange shifting light, my legs carrying me forward on nothing but momentum, and the small, stubborn part of me that had clawed its way back from underneath the asset's directive. and wasn't ready to stop fighting yet. I found her in a side chamber off the main hall, surrounded by healers and guards, who all stepped back the moment Drasquek led me through the door like they understood, without being told that this was a conversation that belonged only to the two of us. There was a mark on her throat where my hand had been. I saw it the second I walked in, and something in my chest folded in on itself at the sight of it. A wound I had put there with my own fingers. No matter how little choice I'd had in the matter, she didn't flinch when I crossed the room toward her. That more than anything else undid me. "I am still here," she said quietly, before I could find any words of my own. "And so are you, whatever that thing was that took your hands for those few seconds. It did not take all of you. I felt the difference, Cole. I felt you fighting your way back through it. I don't know if I'll stay back," I said, because it was the only honest thing I had left to offer her. I don't know what's still in my head, or whether it's finished, or whether the next signal comes through, and I don't make it back in time. She reached up slowly, deliberately, and laid her palm flat against the bruised skin of her own throat, not flinching away from the touch the way anyone with sense would have. "Then we find out together," she said. "I did not choose you because I believed you were safe. Cole Bishop, I chose you because I felt something quiet underneath everything loud about you. And I still feel it now, even after tonight. That has not changed." I sank down beside her chair, my legs finally giving out entirely. And for the first time since the needle of pain had hit behind my eye, I let myself believe just slightly that the man who knelt there, shaking in front of her, was more than the thing that had nearly ended her life an hour earlier. Neither of us knew in that quiet chamber, with the mark still fresh on her skin, that the man lying dead in the side corridor had not worked entirely alone, and that the question of what was still buried inside my own mind had only just begun to be asked. Dominion law has a very specific phrase for what I had become in the eyes of the council, and it took less than a day for Lord Sornail to make sure every member of that council heard it spoken aloud. The phrase translates roughly as unregistered instrument, and the law attached to it is older than the joining ceremony itself. Written in an age when allied worlds first began sharing technology, and needed a way to guard against exactly the kind of thing that had nearly happened in that chamber. The law was simple, and it offered no room for negotiation. An unregistered instrument discovered within Dominion territory was to be destroyed regardless of intent, regardless of circumstance, regardless of anything except the basic fact of what it was capable of doing. I learned about the law from Owen, who delivered the news to me the following morning with the particular gray hollow look of a man who has spent the night rehearsing how to say something he doesn't want to say at all. "They're calling an emergency session," he said, standing in the doorway of the small guest chamber I'd been moved to, while the healers finished checking the veils, pushing it through fast before the dust settles, before anyone has time to ask the questions that might slow it down. He wants a ruling within 3 days. And the ruling is Owen didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "Earth's already distancing itself," he said instead, looking everywhere except directly at me. "I got a transmission an hour ago. Official position back home is that the Anvil program was discontinued, that any actions taken by former assets are not sanctioned by current Earth authority, and that the Dominion should handle the matter according to its own laws." He finally met my eyes. "They're not going to fight for you, Cole. I don't think they ever planned to if it came to this." I sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over something you already suspected, but hadn't wanted to confirm. Earth had built me, used me, shelved me, and now, with the first real chance to either claim me or disown me, had chosen the second option without even the courtesy of a delay. It hurt less than I expected, mostly because some part of me had been bracing for exactly this answer since the day Owen first told me my inclusion in the candidate lottery was just a formality to make the numbers look right. "What about her father?" I asked. "What about these?" "She hasn't stopped fighting since she woke up this morning," Owen said. "But Cole, the law doesn't leave a lot of room for fighting. It's not a question of whether the council believes you're dangerous. They watched you put 3 guards on the ground in 4 seconds, and then take down a fully grown man with your bare hands in front of half the court. The law doesn't care why you did either of those things. It only cares what you're capable of." He left not long after that, and I spent the rest of the morning alone, with a silence that felt heavier than any I'd carried in years, turning over every version of how the next 3 days might end, and finding very few of them that didn't end with me on the wrong side of Dominion law. The S found me again that afternoon, moving slower than usual, a faint bruise still visible along her throat, despite the healer's work, but her eyes carried none of the fear I might have expected after everything. They carried something closer to determination, the particular sharpness she'd warned, the day she stood up in front of the full council to defend a man the rest of the room had already decided to distrust. "I am not going to let them do this," she said before I could say anything at all. "I have already spoken with Drasquick. He has agreed to present everything he found, the full record, the activation signal, all of it to the council before any ruling is made. I will not let Vale write the story of what happened in that hall without the truth standing beside it. The truth is that I almost killed you," I said. "I don't know how the council is supposed to look past that, no matter what else Drasquick presents." "The truth," she said with a firmness that left no room for argument, "is that something outside of you reached into your mind and tried to use you as a weapon against the people you have spent months caring for, and that the moment a crack opened in that control, you used it to save my life instead of taking it. That is not the story of an instrument, Cole. That is the story of a man who fought his way back from something most people would never have survived fighting at all." I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure I deserved one given everything that had happened in that chamber, but I let her words sit with me anyway, because something in the certainty of them gave me a small fragile thing to hold on to through the 2 days that followed. Drask's investigation moved fast once he had full authority to pursue it. Faster than I expected from a man who'd spent our first weeks together, looking at me like a problem waiting to happen. He'd recovered the device the man in the maintenance uniform had been carrying, identified him within hours as Walter Hale, formerly attached to a classified human program that Earth's official channels denied any current knowledge of, and traced the activation signal back through 3 layers of relay points to a private terminal, registered quietly and carefully to one of Lord Sawvale's household staff. The discovery didn't surprise me as much as it should have. Men like Vale rarely did their own dangerous work. They simply provided the room for someone else to do it in. The emergency session convened on the 3rd morning, in the same chamber I'd been questioned in once already. Except this time the room felt different. Fuller, charged with the particular tension of a court that knew it was about to decide something it would be talking about for years afterward. Vale sat near the front, composed and confident, clearly expecting the ruling to go exactly the way he'd planned it. Drasquick spoke first, laying out the evidence with the flat, careful precision of a man who had built his entire career on not letting emotion shape his conclusions. He presented the activation signal traced clearly to Hale's device. He presented the relay record traced just as clearly to Vale's household terminal. He presented finally the detail that changed the temperature of the entire room. The moment in the chamber's own security recording, where my hand had stopped tightening around Thessa's throat, where the directive had visibly broken and redirected itself toward the true source of the attack instead. "This was not an instrument acting according to its design," Dask said, addressing the full council with none of the suspicion he'd shown me in our first meeting. "This was a man fighting a design that had been forced back into him, against his will, by an outside party with clear motive to see this alliance fail. I would ask this council to consider very carefully whose hands actually built the danger in that chamber, before deciding whose life should be forfeit for it." Vale rose immediately to object, his composure cracking for the first time since the session began, and the resulting exchange filled the better part of an hour. Accusation and counter-accusation, council members pressing him on details of his household terminal that he struggled to explain away. I watched it unfold from my place near the center of the chamber, and somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped being the central question the room was trying to answer, and became instead a piece of evidence in a much larger argument about who in that court could be trusted at all. The sovereign called for silence eventually, raising one broad hand until the chamber settled, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of a man who had been listening more carefully than anyone in the room realized. The law concerning unregistered instruments exists to protect this house from weapons that act according to their own design, with no will beyond what they were built to execute, he said slowly. What I have heard today describes something else entirely. A man built once into a weapon who has spent these recent months demonstrating repeatedly a will of his own, one that runs counter to the very design Lord Vale wishes this council to fear. He turned his gaze toward me, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something other than careful suspicion in his expression. I am inclined to believe my daughter's judgment in this matter. The tasting does not read history, it reads intention. She felt something in you worth choosing, and everything I have heard since suggests she was not wrong to trust it. He didn't simply dismiss the matter, though. There was a condition attached to his ruling, one that took the better part of another hour to negotiate. A binding agreement that Dominion healers would work alongside human specialists to identify and neutralize whatever remained of the activation pathway in my mind, ensuring no future signal could ever again reach the part of me that Hale's program had built. I agreed to it without hesitation. I would have agreed to far worse given everything at stake. And there was a strange relief in finally having someone with the right knowledge looking for the thing I'd spent 6 years pretending wasn't still there. Stripped of his council seat within the week, his household dissolved pending a full investigation into his dealings with Hale, he disappeared from court life entirely, the particular disappearance reserved for nobles who have made themselves too inconvenient to keep around. I never saw him again, and I can't say I missed the looking. The procedure to address what remained of the activation pathway took place 2 weeks later. A careful, methodical process that left me drained in a way no fight ever had, lying still for hours while specialists from 2 different worlds worked together on something neither of them fully understood alone. I woke from it, uncertain, the way Dasquek had once warned the sovereign I might wake, unsure for a long, frightening stretch of minutes, whether the man who opened his eyes in that recovery chamber was entirely the one who closed them. Theas was the first thing I saw when the uncertainty finally cleared enough to focus. She sat beside the bed, exactly where she'd apparently been sitting through the entire procedure, watching me with an expression that held no trace of fear, only the quiet, steady patience of someone willing to wait, as long as it took to find out who had woken up. "Well," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "I'll be dipped, still here." Something in her shoulders loosened, a tension I hadn't realized she was holding until it released. "Yes," she said, "still here, both of you. I think it wasn't a clean ending, the kind storytellers like to wrap a ribbon around. There was no ceremony marking the moment the procedure declared a success. No single instant where the danger could be said to have fully passed. What there was instead was smaller and more honest than that. A loud sound from somewhere down the corridor a few days later, a tray dropped by a careless servant, the exact kind of noise that had once put a blade in my hand before my mind caught up with my body. I flinched. My hand twitched toward a weapon I wasn't carrying, and then a half-second later, I caught myself, breathed, and let it go. V.S., sitting beside me on a low bench in the garden, where we'd had so many of our hardest conversations, didn't flinch back. She didn't pull away, didn't reach for me the way a person reaches for someone they're worried might break. She simply watched the moment pass across my face, watched me catch it and set it down on my own, and reached over to take my hand once the shaking had stopped, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Better," she said quietly. "Every week a little better." I believed her. I still believe her now. Most days, though, I won't pretend the quiet thing underneath, everything loud about me has gone away entirely. Some things once built deep enough don't fully leave. They just learn to answer to someone, other than the person who built them. It was almost 3 months later, long after the court had moved on to other concerns, and the story of the joining ceremony had faded into the particular kind of palace history people only bring up at quiet dinners, that Valen Drasqui found me in the training yard and handed me a single data file without explanation, his expression carrying none of its usual flat composure. "You'd see this," was all he said. I read it standing in the same yard where Dominion guards practiced forms I still didn't fully recognize. And somewhere in the second paragraph, the ground under that particular kind of certainty I'd built about my own past quietly gave way, The file was a fragment of Walter Hale's private records recovered during the investigation into his activities, mostly technical notes about the activation protocol, the kind of dense administrative language that took 3 readings to fully untangle, but buried in a footnote near the bottom. In a section, discussing program designations, was a line that didn't match anything I had ever been told about myself. Subject's original designation prior to administrative reeing following Phase 1 incident was Asset 001. Subsequent designation as Asset 09 was applied for security purposes following the loss of contact with assets numbered 2 through 8. I read that sentence 4 times before its full meaning settled into place. I had spent 6 years believing I was the 9th attempt. One experiment among many that had simply run longer than the others before slipping out of the program's control. The truth sitting quietly in a footnote that Hale had apparently never bothered correcting in any record I'd ever seen was something else entirely. I had been the first, the original, and somewhere in that single line was an admission I hadn't been looking for and didn't know how to set down once I picked it up. 2 through 8. 8 assets built after me, modeled on whatever it was that had made the first attempt successful enough to keep building on. Lost contact didn't mean destroyed. I knew that better than anyone, given that I had spent 6 years being a piece of lost contact myself, walking around on a logistics contract, with a bad knee in a quiet manner, completely invisible to a program that had stopped looking for me, long before I'd stopped looking over my shoulder. I looked up from the file out across the training yard, where they stood near the far wall, watching a pair of guards spar, laughing at something one of them had said, entirely unaware of what I just learned. 8 more of me somewhere out there built from whatever the program had learned from getting me right the first time. I folded the file closed, tucked it into my jacket, and walked toward her across the yard. Because whatever came next, whatever those 8 other names eventually turned out to mean, I had learned at least one thing clearly enough in the month since a princess first called me quiet, in a hall full of strangers. Some things are worth walking toward, even when you don't yet know everything waiting on the other.